Hello, so I want to talk about bailiffs, mainly because they're broken by just one, being very strong in an intended way, and two, by being very strong but not in an intended way. Anyway, I'm not allowed to show EU5, so I'll be using EU4 and Paint.net today for the video, if it can be called that, but before we do continue, I also want to quickly say that despite this overall being quite a negative video, my opinion nevertheless remains that EU5 is good. I mean, there's a reason I'm playing it after all. But anyway, despite it being a really ironic situation to go, look, this thing in EU5 is broken, please buy it. Well, if you're interested in pre-ordering EU5, please use the link in the description, or use code Lemon Cake for a 0% discount. It helps support the channel. But naturally, as always, a like would be appreciated, and a subscription would be amazing, but enough self-shilling. Let's talk about the Bailiff. Right, so here we are. I'm allowed to use this building showcase that Paradox has very generously provided by posting a community post with the Bailiff building in question. So, I can use that because they posted it. You all have access to this. I'm not showing you anything from the game, so this is all good. Now, in EU4, we had this modifier called autonomy, and in EU5, this is replaced by something called control. Okay, so what does control do? Well, relatively simply, it's how much you actually, as a government, control from a location. What this means is that if you have 100% control on a location, and you have a building that produces, let's say, 10 ducats of value, and you tax the building at 10%, you will actually get 10% of this 10 ducats, you will get 1 ducat of income. So far, so good. And of course, if you have, let's say, 50% control, this exact same 10 ducat building, which would then, you would tax at 10%, again, the taxes are a variable rate, you would only make 0.5 ducats from it. So far, so good, right? Okay, that's control. Now, the thing with control that's important to realize is that most buildings don't just produce money. In EU5, let's say you have a toolsmith. What it's going to do is going to take bars of like iron. This is meant to be an iron bar. Let's all pretend this is an iron bar together. And what this building is going to do is it's going to convert it into a tool. So I'm going to go draw a sickle here. There we go. It's making sickles. Everyone's really happy. Our farmers are very ecstatic. And if we have 100% control, we're able to tax all of the income of this transaction, right? But at 50% control, we are able to tax half of this transaction, but the workshop still buys this like iron and it still produces the sickles. So even though you're only taxing half the income, it doesn't mean that the workshop is 50% productive. It means the workshop is 100% productive. And what this can mean in practice is that if you actually just need sickles, you don't care about making money from the situation, it does make sense to build manufactories or workshops or whatever you want in non-high control areas. The sickles still enter the market despite this control level. So even if you have 0 control, right, but let's say you have a very, very built-up industry area, you still want to keep it, even though you want to invest in the control naturally to be able to tax this thing, just because if it's the only global source of, let's say there's only one cannon maker in the world, right, and then so you want to keep buying these cannons, even if you're not taxing the thing and you've conquered it, you probably want cannons to keep existing in your market. So you don't want to destroy it, and even though there's 0% control on it, these cannons are still entering the market. So okay, that's an important distinction. Glad we're all on the same page, okay? If you don't control something, it doesn't mean it just disappears. However, pops have different types of jobs. We have the base pool of pops, the people digging around in the dirt and basically growing food and not much else. We're going to put them at the bottom. And this is where the majority of the population actually lives at game start anyway. And eventually, what you want to do is you want to promote them into craftsmen. These are the people that make things with hammers. We're going to have these that grow food here. This is meant to be an apple. They're out here doing things with hammers, or traders. There we go. That's another thing. Your burgher estates or the clergy, they run hospitals and write books. So let's do a little bit of a book illustration, right? And of course your nobles, and we'll get to the nobility later. The nobles just kind of sit there, let's be honest. But pops promote when jobs are available here. So let's say that you build a new RGO that extracts, let's say you chops down more lumber, right? This would create more RGO jobs, so you need people to promote. Promotion speed is affected by control, and at 100% control, the effect on promotion speed is nothing. However, at 0% control, your promotion speed is reduced by 100%. So what this means is that if your game plan is that I do not care about taxing anything, I don't want to have any control, but I still want to grow food and feed my peasants, you actually can't do that because you build all of these industries like this lumber mill here, right? Or even you'd expand farms, and people will not promote out of their subsistence agriculture into the farms, or they will not promote into the workshops. Now, if the province had 100 control and everyone promoted in, and then it dropped down to 0 control, that's fine. demotion isn't affected by control, but control is very important for promotion. Control is a bit of a weird one in this case, because I feel like in real life you don't really need the government's approval to like take a new job. But I think it's going for like it's a state-run RGO or industry to promote into that, which isn't also the case because estates can also build well, they can't build RGOs, but they can build like a one of these like buildings here that would employ people. So it's kind of weird. I don't think I like control being necessarily tied to promotion, but it's fine, right? It's an acceptable mechanic. But it just means that control is still very, very important because you want people to actually promote into jobs. So you kind of want control everywhere anyway. And as well, when it comes to control, both the act of culture conversion and religious conversion, right? Both of these are also affected by control. So when you send out a guy that's, going to spread the word of Jesus, and you send him out to a province, if you have 0 control, his conversion speed is also reduced by 100%. And at 100 control, his conversion speed is unaffected. So if you want to convert your provinces, or frankly do anything with them, you're going to want control. And now, this building, the Bailiff, does not give you control, it gives you proximity source. We'll talk about the source in a second, but proximity does not correlate control 1-to-1. It's a ratio, because of course it is, and at 100 proximity to the capital, at 100 prox, you gain 75 control. Now, there are other sources of control, namely, for example, building a temple. Temples give you +5 control. The Ottomans have a tech for like +5 control flat everywhere, which is very strong. And just being like a urban city, so a city is +5, and I believe a towns are +5, and like cities are +10, but I'm not too sure on the numbers, to be honest, they might get changed. So there are other sources of control, or base control in the game, but in general, proximity, 100 proximity gives you 75 control. And this matters because this +30 proximity, so +30 prox, actually only translates to about +22.75 control, right? Which, for all grand schemes, we're just going to say this is 20% control, right? Okay, so we're all on the same page here. Proximity also doesn't stack because this is a local proximity source. Your capital gives you a local proximity source of 100. These gives you +30. If you build 2 next to each other, you don't stack to combine to like 55 proximity or anything. It just gives you an extra local source of 30, and obviously things decay from there. Right, glad we're on the same page here. The thing is, this is obviously quite strong, especially when you realize in early game just how quickly proximity decays. And for that, let's get into EU4. So I loaded into England here, into EU4, just because I'm going to demonstrate as I've played with England before in EU5, so I can kind of, from experience, talk about the proximity decay rates. And again, the map is a lot bigger. This province in London is like 3 provinces. Oxford is split up into honestly like 10 provinces or locations. The map's significantly larger just in province count. It's pretty absurd, to be honest. Anyway, so how bad is proximity access? Well, you kind of start running out of proximity from London by the time you hit Somerset and Devon. Like, by Derby, by Sheffield, by these bits of land over here, you're out of control, right? That's it. Well, you still have control because, for example, York is a town, so you get +5 from that and it has a temple and so on and so forth. But you're out of proximity by, like, this kind of circle around London here. So it's pretty bad. Like, Wales, you have 0 proximity to. Devon, Cornwall, 0 proximity and hence 0 base control coming in. Awful stuff, right? So the actual decay from proximity at game start is really bad. And bear in mind, London actually has a road up to, like, Northumberland, so there is already a road built here, already helping you spread your proximity. So it's not even as abysmal as it is super early game. But bear in mind, right at the start, you have no centralization and max centralization. Each province has a reduced -10 proximity cost, for example. And then better roads reduce proximity cost, and by the time you get to railways, they reduce proximity cost by like -70%, I believe. So like proximity becomes insane, and you can be able to get 100 control over like most of Europe and so on and so forth. But at game start, it's pretty bad. And the other thing to bear in mind is that if you're looking at something like Hampshire, because I wanted to build up the port of Southampton, because it's a nice port location, because that's an actual thing you have to worry about in EU5, is how good of a natural harbour a port is when you want to build it up. And Southampton's a pretty nice natural harbour. By the time I get to there, I'm already down to like 50 proximity. And like London's right here. So that's how bad the proximity decay is. And again, England's a relatively centralized country. I mean, everyone's basically decentralized. But if we look at France, because I also did a campaign as France, it's so bad that specifically, well, within the domain of France is you're hyper decentralized. And from Paris to Calais, I hit 0 proximity. Like, your proximity just decays outside of this core. Like, you're allowed a little slice of Normandy, like this is it. What I'm selecting here, this is what you actually have proximity to in like a decentralized environment. It is really bad. Now, of course, with decentralization, there's other things coming in, but what I'm trying to say here is that if you're trying to rely on your capital for proximity, you're going to run out of space relatively quickly. Like, it's not good. And just to really drive the point home, by the time I'm playing Byzantium, and again, this is the campaign that I posted the short about, well, Athens, that's too far away. Even by sea, I'm getting 0 proximity to Athens. Now, obviously, eventually be able to build up more of a maritime presence and so on and so forth. But when I'd reconquered Athens, I literally had 0 proximity to it. That's how bad it was. Like, by the time you're getting to Selanik, you're kind of running out of proximity. Like, I think this by sea from Byzantium is the extent of what proximity extended to, right? And so by the time you're out on Albania, too far away. So yeah, proximity is really hard to get in this game, especially super early. So obviously shoving bailiffs everywhere for that plus 30 local source, aka plus 20% autonomy everywhere, or I guess good autonomy, sounds pretty good, right? And that's kind of why the building's pretty strong. So indeed, this local proximity source, that is the selling point of the building. But I want to bring to your attention another small issue. The bailiff can only be built in these settlements, the circles, aka rural settlements. You can't really build it in your urban or cities. That's fine as a requirement. But how do they balance the bailiff? Well, first of all, the bailiff itself costs 200 gold. This is a lie. And the reason I mention this as a lie is that because it's going to cost you masonry and this costs you lumber. What this actually means is that it costs you 200 gold worth of these trade goods. And as I play the game, one of the things I've consistently found is that apparently there's a global shortage of lumber, like everywhere. It's not as bad as a global shortage of gold in Europe, so I guess it's not really a global shortage. Europe just doesn't believe in gold. Like, the bullion famine in gold is very real and very bad. But lumber is a pretty in-demand trade good. And it's not in demand if you're not building, but let's put it this way, in EU5, you're basically building the whole game, so lumber becomes quite in demand, which does drive this price up. However, masonry, it can be in demand, but the actual masonry buildings themselves can be relatively spammable. And once you've invested in masonry buildings, because most things actually need masonry, you drive construction costs down a lot. And yes, you can also invest into lumber, and you do end up investing into lumber because it's quite profitable to invest in lumber. But realistically, this 200 number, I've seen this anywhere between 150 to 100 ducats in terms of its like actual cost in practice. And if you're min-maxing lumber and masonry supply, you could probably get this down to like 50 a pop. So this is super spammable. The cost isn't that much of an issue, and especially within the domain of EU5, economy scaling is significantly stronger. For example, if you were to build a fine cloth manufactory or workshop, this is my attempt to be at fine cloth, and I've just kind of made a, I'm not very good at drawing. I don't even draw fine cloth. Anyway, if you want to build one of these buildings, it's going to give you a base tax increase, as in the profit of the one workshop, of around 20 ducats. Now, obviously, you're not immediately making that, but if you put that in your capital where you have 100 control because you have 100 control in your capital, this 20 ducats, let's say you're taxing your burghers, which is what the people working your fine silk, because this is silk. Let me just label this as your fine cloth silk, right? This 20 ducats, you're taxing them at 25%. Yeah, that's quite a bit of money, as you probably guessed. You're now making 5. And that's not like a workshop making 0.5 ducats. No. This is one silk workshop making 5 ducats at 25% taxes. And 25% taxes aren't anything insane. If you really want to go burger tax maxing, you can definitely get up to the 50% and so on. So economy scaling in EU5 is significantly easier, which again makes this cost much easier to stomach. Like, it is not insane for Byzantium to have, like, by 1437, something like 350 income, whatever I had. That's like, it's enough money, specifically because you can afford all the buildings, but it's not like, hey, I've been hyper-focused on economy, right? So just want to really reiterate, the bailiff is goddamn spammable everywhere. And I think Paradox is aware of that. So one of the other things they've done to offset the bailiff being spammable is this noble's power. And what this basically does is it means that if we go back to our previous like graphs where there are a bunch of people that were living in provinces, right? Well, each one of the estates that possesses the owners, your laborers, the people that are hammering it away or like growing the food on subsistence agriculture, or even the burghers that are like, doing some trade things. This is meant to be a coin pile. All these people, they also have some kind of level of power in each location, right? So how much literal political power they have in each area. And if, for example, some peasants build a local assembly, they can increase their power, right? So far, so good. And hence the balancing point for the bailiff is that it is going to increase the power of the nobility by 50%. There is, however, one very small problem with increasing the nobility power of the bailiff by 50%. The fact is that bailiffs are built in rural areas, and rural areas tend to be the underdeveloped backwater parts of your country, which is where you're building the bailiffs. And backwater rural parts of your country don't really tend to have a lot of, well, nobility, right? They don't really tend to exist. And let's do some live maths together with Lemon Cake. I promise it's not going to be that advanced, but what we do is if we have 0 nobles in a location, and we build a bailiff so they get plus 50% nobility power, what happens is our 0 nobles now get a 1.5 modifier to their power, which means the nobility has no power anyway. Paradox has also probably realized this, and so they've decided, okay, we're going to balance this by shoving 10 noble jobs onto the province. So for the bailiff to work, it needs all 10 of these jobs to be worked, and it becomes like partially effective as only 5 nobles work in the bailiff. And this has an issue because you actually need to promote into nobility. And remember, if you have 0% control, your promotion speed is minus 100%, which means if you build a bailiff where there's 0 control, which is where you want to build a bailiff, you'd actually have 0 promotion into the bailiff. So you'll never get worked, which means you'll never have control, which means no one will ever promote or take a noble job. Very annoying, but you can circumnavigate it. There are temporary cabinet actions you can to temporarily erase control in an area, so you can like play around it. But once you've done all this, and once your location has gained 10 nobles, right? Well, nobles are relatively hard to get. Not that many nobles actually exist in a country. And 10 nobles, in the grand scheme of things, is actually a non-trivial amount of nobles. Like, the base amount you get for a city is like 50 nobles, right? And so again, just want to really reiterate this. The noble bailiff building is spammable and provides you with 10 noble jobs. And why is that so, well, good? Well, this is where the second part of the bailiff becomes hyper-broken. It's based upon what I would like to, well, I guess coin the term, and that is the EU5 infinite credit card economy. We kind of touched upon the earlier trade goods here, for example, fine silks, and the reason that those fine silks, let me attempt to redraw the fine silks yet again. Yeah, I should not be allowed to draw. But nevertheless, the reason that these things have profit is because pops, like the nobility, want to buy fine silks. And as such, if there is a supply and demand imbalance, like at the start of the game, for example, there's just apparently no supply of fine silks, so the price is really high, and frankly stays quite a bit high, well, it's a pretty profitable endeavor. But as you may imagine, if you build loads of fine silk buildings, the price will eventually go down and you arrive at an equilibrium. Still though, the way to make money is you kind of need financial demand for trade goods to actually grow your economy. If there's no one in the country with money to buy your stuff, you won't be able to grow your economy. So far so good, and that makes relative sense. But there is another quirk that Paradox had to, well, I guess add. And that is that as a country, you can go into negative money. As in, if you go below 0, you're forced to take loans, and if you run out of loan cap, you go bankrupt, all these bad things, right? So your money as a crown, we'll draw this as a crown, is allowed to be negative, right? It's allowed to be less than, like, an amount. You can go into negative money. For the estates, that's your nobilities, or, well, I'm not sure how to really represent the estates, so I'm just going to give them big building. There we go. For the estates, Paradox has decided that they can't go into negative money. If estates run out of money, they don't go into debt, they just have 0 money. And that's fine, we don't have to worry about estates taking loans or whatever, that's okay. But their second problem has come in with this development. Because we need to now talk about food very briefly. And the thing that you need to realize with food is that food in EU5 is actually a relatively terrible trade good until it isn't. Because food is basically like super cheap, we're talking like 0.1 per unit of food as a consumable item. But if there's a famine, or some kind of other disaster like that, this price of food goes through the roof very, very quickly. And what can happen is that in a famine, as the global price of food goes up, and this 0.1 keeps going up and up and up, you'll end up at like 100 for a price of food, which means that importing food becomes ridiculously expensive. But what can also happen is that if you have a bunch of peasants in your country, they are not going to be able to afford this food. And so you end up in a state where you actually have enough food in your local market, right? So you actually produce enough food, or let's say you've imported enough food, so you should not have a famine, no famine, right? Because you have enough food. But because this food is so expensive, the peasants, right, they can't afford to actually buy the food, so they end up starving anyway. And as you imagine, that's pretty annoying if you've like invested into agriculture, you've built up loads of food sources, and you still end up having a famine just because there's like a global famine and the peasants can't afford to buy the food in your market. So in essence, to prevent the peasants basically starving if they have no food, Paradox Interactive has come up with this genius solution. Namely, is that if you have no money, but you still demand a trade good like food, you're still allowed to just buy it. And so what happens is that even though this food is now worth 100 gold, the peasant buys the food, they don't starve, so you don't have to worry about the fact that you have food in your market, but your peasants can't afford it, so, you know, they end up starving. And that's obviously a very good thing. You don't really want your peasants to starve. So, like, I actually want this to be kept in the game. Like, can you imagine being in a state where there is enough food for everyone, but just because some people can't afford food, they end up starving? Like, that sounds really stupid. So Paradox has fixed this. You can't just buy food even if you can't afford it. But again, just since we've, like, this is, I believe, the intention behind this game decision, right? Paradox basically lets you issue buy orders for food or actually any trade good, even if you can't afford it. And I really want to stretch this importance here, because we now want to talk about what do the actual pops demand. Now, there's a couple other estates. Obviously, you can sometimes get like unique things like the tribes or Cossacks or whatever, but your main estates, your peasants, your burghers, your clergy, and we're going to have the nobility here on the side. What happens is that, think about how these estates make money. What the peasants do is the peasants go out, they go chop some wood to make some lumber, they go make some masonry, right? That's kind of what peasants do. So the peasants have like an income, not a great income, but they have an income. And what do the peasants spend their income on? Well, first of all, they pay you taxes, of course, so taxes are great, they pay you their taxes, but then they go and they buy food, they go and they buy alcohol, and then sometimes, but relatively rarely, they'll buy like furniture. I can't really spell furniture, you probably can't read that. And sometimes, apart from furniture, they'll also buy like a new shirt, right? So they'll buy some cloth. And if I had to give like a pie chart or a graph of what I tend to find the peasants demand, I'd say around 45% of peasants' disposable income goes towards food. This is meant to be an apple. And then around 40% goes towards the alcohol. And then the remaining like 15% is split between furniture and cloth, right? That's your peasants. So the main things they're doing is basically food and alcohol. If anyone is a peasant, please confirm that this is what you spend your money on. Nevertheless, though, the burghers, they're a bit better. Now, burghers make their money from, you know, trade stuff, and to be fair, so do the clergy. The clergy also, you know, they write books in scriptoriums, they go operate hospitals, all of these estates have sources of money. They all tend to pay you taxes, although the clergy doesn't really pay you taxes all that much. All of them buy food, of course, but burghers, they might demand something a bit more exotic sometimes. They'll sometimes buy some more cloth than the peasants. Especially the clergy, they tend to buy a bit more cloth than peasants. So you have a bit more of a luxury goods demands, but not that much, right? And the general gist is that in a normal functional state, because the peasants, burghers, and clergy all have sources of reliable income, and if you tax them something stupid like 80% of their income, they all tend to still be fine. I look at my estates, and by pretty late game, they are stupidly rich. They have like hundreds of thousands of ducats they've saved away. Like, all of these estates tend to be absolutely fine economically. But then, we have to talk about the nobles. The nobles tend to make most of their money, not because they are working really hard, but basically because they tax people. So as you can see here, this noble's power here gives them some power in the location, so they can make money by, you know, building some noble castles and extracting wealth from the local area, and those kinds of things. So that's the income source of nobility, right? Because for the most part, from an economic point of view, all that nobles really do is they just kind of sit there and get paid tax. They don't really contribute anything to society in terms of creating value. And this is starting to sound political, but I promise you I'm just talking about EU5. Nevertheless, what this means is that if you are the government and you're basically clamping down on noble power and you revoke a bunch of their privileges and you're like really, you know, bring them under your heel so that they don't really tax other people because you want to tax people. You're the one doing the taxes here, not the nobles, right? What very quickly happens is that the nobles don't really have an income. Like, they don't really make much money. And then they still have to pay you taxes on that income, which obviously hurts a lot more. But the nobles have the greatest list of luxury demands. They demand literal gold and silver. They demand cloth. This is, again, meant to be the my attempt at cloth. They demand, you know, gold bars. This looks very similar to cloth, but okay, so they'll demand things like gold. They'll demand jewelry. They'll demand, this is a ring. All of these things are very, very expensive, right? The nobility, they demand ridiculously luxury trade goods all the time, and they demand a lot of them. And as you may realize, there's a bit of a problem coming here, because the nobility are broke, right? You've just revoked a bunch of the tax rights. You're taxing them. The nobility is like, just as an example from the Byzantium game, my nobility had an income of like 60 ducats as a whole estate. Meanwhile, my peasants are making 100, my burghers are making around 200, and my clergy was making around 150, right? So then my nobles are broke. This is terrible. And of those 60 ducats, I'm taxing them like 20 ducats as well. I'm taxing them at like 30%, because why wouldn't you tax the nobles? I've like, reined them in free money, okay? So in essence, once I've done all of this, like taxation, so I'm not taxing them 20%, my apologies, this is just lies and slander. I'm taxing them 20 ducats, I'm taxing them at 30%. TLDR, the nobles end up with 40 ducats of income. However, the nobles still want to buy gold bars, jewelry, and everything. And remember the thing I talked about food earlier? Yeah, they can just still do that. And so hence in my Byzantium game, the reason my economy is doing as well as it is because the nobles are making 60 ducats. They're spending 20 on taxes. And they were spending, and I'm not kidding here, I'm just going to share the number as it was, 350 ducats each month on importing luxury trade goods. And now you may be wondering very quickly that this ain't adding up, Chief, right? If we run the numbers on this one, it comes to minus 310 ducats. However, estates can't go in negative money, so the nobles just sit on zero money forever. And what this means is that every single noble that you produce from places like bailiffs get access to the infinite credit card, which lets them spend all of this stupid money into the economy. And this is real money. The buy orders are filled. The cloth is bought. This money then goes back into the buildings, which is why the burghers are able to get so rich and why the peasants are able to get so rich. Because they're basically living off the nobility credit card. This is it. I've discovered trickle-down economics in EU5, and it's completely broken. The entire meta at the moment, financially, I believe, genuinely boils down to just spamming bailiffs everywhere, because it's the only reliable source of, well, noble jobs. They're very hard to procure otherwise, but if you just shove a bailiff in every single building, you'll just produce, like, literal thousands, I mean thousands of nobility that will walk around your court, create demands for luxury trade goods, and just farm infinite money. Now, I've had the preview of a conversation with Playmaker indeed, and I was wondering if he was also using the nobility exploit, and he told me he wasn't, but he was also building a bailiff server for the local proximity source. Now, this was his Europe game. And I said, I want to see it. How much are your nobles actually making? Because he's basically also pressed the nobles. He's gone revolutionary. He's like, got rid of all of the nobles, right? So nobles had like nothing going for them, right? They were hyper oppressed in Playmaker's game, and they were like super taxed as well. So I was just curious, like, how were the nobles holding up in Playmaker's campaign? And bear in mind, again, he's basically shoved a bailiff in all of Europe. And then when we both saw the numbers, it was hilarious. Because the bailiffs in like the 1800s, and the bailiff nobility and all of this, well, they were having an income of around 300 each month. Playmaker would then tax them 150. The bailiffs would then go ahead and spend 10k each month on luxury trade goods, while at the same time remaining on zero balance. And I think this is the most hilarious part, but the bailiff nobility that the Playmaker had in his save was at one point, inside of just one market, spending around 700 on just fine cloth. So they were buying just like 700. They were spending double their income each month on clothing in just one market because they were nobles and demanded it. And it was fine because they just sat at zero income. And this is why I think one of the reasons of the economy is so easy right now, because you just have the nobility credit card engine to just hyper start your economy. All of this money appears out of nowhere. Basically, every single month, Playmaker was producing 10k money just out of thin air, real cash that was injected into the economy with no inflationary effects from the nobility credit card system, right? And obviously, this is an incredible economic boost. It's basically 10k of foreign aid in the form of nobility just coming in each month, injected right into creating jobs and, well, growing the economy. And it is for this reason that the bailiffs are truly overpowered. But with all that said, that is unfortunately all the time I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching, with a special thank you to all my channel members, especially Ark, Solar, Lemon, Lozendika, Nekas, Nanhatan, Star72, The Awesome Rabbit, Bespero Gaming, Grandma Flavia, Lebarule, W Haste, Salt, Anthony35, AC Napa, Conspiracy Pizza, Yukata, Danre, Malvi, Jack, Ryland, Stuart Allen, Andrew Black, Nebula, Zentronic, and Twoiner.